Hey guys, so let's talk a little bit about arm weight. I've been getting a few comments recently where people have questions about arm weight, or other people are sort of trying to point out the foolishness of using arm weight, saying things like, my arm weighs, 6 kilograms, I think the one comment said, so it's just ridiculous to think that I'm going to use all of that weight to play every key when the key only requires 50 grams to go down. And in the sense that the commenter puts it, yeah, it sounds ridiculous to use arm weight, but of course that's not really how arm weight functions. So let's talk about it a little bit. So the first thing that I just want to mention very briefly is that it's important to understand that arm weight and finger independence or finger movement or strength are not really sort of at odds with each other. In fact, in a well-functioning, well-working technique, they work together. So just in the same way that your torso and your legs work and move together, if I shift my weight from one leg to the next leg, everything moves, even my head moves. In the same way, your arm works in coordination with your fingers, and the weight can be this dynamic sort of relationship with the finger motion to get different sounds, to get the speed that you need, etc. But what it does is it helps your fingers not get fatigued. And this is just naturally how well-functioning techniques play. I believe that anyone who plays extremely well and doesn't have problems, this is essentially how they're playing. And I've talked about this in other videos. But so first I just want to kind of mention that. Now, getting back to this idea of the arm being ridiculously heavy to put down the key that only takes 50 grams of weight. So first of all, I think I looked up that the average arm on a person is 5 to 6% of their total body weight. So if you weigh 150 pounds, that's about 9-10 pounds, I believe. So that's a lot of weight. 10 pounds, let's say, to 50 grams. Now, the first thing to understand is that we don't use the weight of our whole arm. Our upper arm hangs from our shoulder, and all this weight is just hanging here. By definition, it can't be sitting on the keyboard, so we're only really using the weight of our forearm. And the way that our muscles are positioned and the way they work, we can actually dynamically change the amount of weight that we put into each finger. So we can have a very little amount of weight, or we can have more weight, okay? And usually, sometimes I hear people complain that it hurts when they try to use weight, or it just feels too heavy and they feel like their fingers get stuck. And this is usually because of one of two things in my experience. So it's usually because we're actually pushing with the arm, so you're actually pushing or leaning into the keys. And the other thing is that I often see is that we're trying to use too much weight. So we're trying to be so relaxed that all of our weight is sitting there, and we don't need that much weight. And the fingers will actually buckle, or they can, if you're using too much weight. Now, a little caveat on that, and the reason that the fingers might buckle is not actually because the fingers are weak, but it's actually because the fingers aren't in the proper position to support that weight really well. For instance, I can literally lean into the piano with my fingers in a good supported position, and it doesn't hurt at all. I don't feel any discomfort. And I believe that's because of the position my fingers are in, not the fact that my fingers are somehow strong. Again, I've never spent any time trying to strengthen my fingers, none of those exercises whatsoever. So that's the first thing that we have to understand. Now, another thing that I would like to mention is the fact that usually when we use arm weight, there's this misconception that we should feel heavy at the fingertip. This is not true. You should never feel heavy when you play. If you feel heavy, that means either you're using too much weight, so the entire weight of your arm is there, or it means that there's muscular collapse or joint collapse. And let me explain what I mean. So when you stand, like I'm standing right now, I don't feel heavy. I have this sort of buoyant, light sort of feeling, okay? And that's because my joints are in a good position to support the weight into the ground. I'm standing up, etc. Now, when you lay on the floor and you try to relax every part of your body, what you'll notice is that you feel kind of heavy, okay? You'll notice that if you focus in on what it feels like on your upper back, between your shoulders where you're touching the ground, it feels kind of heavy. You don't have this weightless feeling. And because when the joints sort of relax like that, you know, it starts kind of loading the nerves and saying, okay, now it feels kind of heavy. Like if I lean back like this, it feels heavy because I'm loading those muscles and they're sort of tensed. Or in the opposite side, that's the kind of the opposite thing. If I relax my arm like this, right? All of a sudden it feels heavy right here. But if I take my arm and I just kind of wave it in the air like this, right? It feels very light and sort of, you know, buoyant, etc. And so it's the same thing when we play the piano. When I'm playing, I have no sensation that it's heavy. It feels very light, and it doesn't really feel like I'm sitting there with all this weight, you know, in the same way that if you just take your hand and you just pretend like you're playing on a tabletop, it sort of feels like that. That's usually a very good sensation to sort of teach people what it should feel like on the keyboard, is pretend like you're playing the piano and you just sort of do this, like, you know, play a scale or something. Now, you instinctively will not press hard on the tabletop because it doesn't move. And so you can just kind of do this. Oh, look at that. It feels nice and light, okay? Now, it should feel the same way. Now, in the same way that you're kind of resting your hand here, usually we don't sort of hover, but we kind of rest our hand there, right? We just rest our hand and I'm sort of tapping my fingers. And that's sort of the way it works at the keyboard too. So, again, yes, if you think of arm weight in terms of using the whole weight of your arm, again, like 10 pounds, or even 5 pounds is very excessive. It's very excessive. However, that is what's so brilliant about the way the human body works, is that we can perfectly regulate that weight so that we can have just enough to keep the key down, and then we just support that weight in our arm, and it just works really well, and it keeps our fingers from getting fatigued, etc. It keeps them from having to do everything on their own. Now, we can also then, you know, use more weight. So, okay, I'm gonna let more weight sink into the keys, which is gonna put the key down faster. It's gonna give me a louder sound, etc. But in addition to this, we can use more finger motion, and that will also accelerate the key. And this is, again, what I mentioned at the beginning. Arm weight and finger movement or independence, they're not at odds with each other. They work perfectly together. That idea of finger independence is also somewhat of a myth. The fingers can never be fully independent of each other. I made a video about it, about that about 6 months ago, and I shared an article where there's a study done about, you know, individual sort of isolated independent movements of the fingers and the sympathetic movements of the other fingers, and they found that every single finger where they're moving independently had some amounts of sympathetic movements in the other fingers. And that to me is a great example of how the fingers can never be purely independent, but the whole idea is that when we use rotation, when we use arm weight, when we use lateral arm movements, when we use, you know, up-down sort of gesture is what I call it. When we do all of these things, we don't need to have the fingers be perfectly independent from each other. And it's very freeing in our technique because now our fingers aren't being overworked. Now our arm is able to move. Now we can actually play with the arm in a quote-unquote loose sort of relaxed state, because that's essentially what that means. You know, when we have a loose wrist when we play, it's not that the loose wrist is really floppy, it's that it's moving and always in the correct position. The joint is always where it needs to be, just like when we walk, so that it feels relaxed, but it's not ultimately relaxed. So anyways, hope that clears up some of your thinking in terms of arm weight. If you have more questions about arm weight, leave a comment down below. Love to answer more of your question. Thank you so much. See you next time.